The word EMF, or electromagnetic field, is a broad one, and contained in it are the things that evolve around electric appliances and power lines, extremely low frequency fields. And this EMF issue also encompasses radio frequency radiation and microwave radiation. And those are emissions that you get from cell phones, cell towers, Wi-Fi and WiMAX, wireless communications. So it's really broadly all of those things that either give us electric power or that give us the ability to communicate in a wireless fashion. And there are emissions, and they have important biological effects. In 2006, a group of scientists met at the Bioelectromagnetic Society annual meeting in Mexico. And we presented a mini symposium on electromagnetic fields and radio frequency radiation to highlight a couple of things for several hundred scientists who meet at those meetings. The first was to focus on the science, to say, these are the studies we believe show an effect at levels that are everyday levels, and we might want to be concerned about this. And secondly, to talk about what kind of precautionary actions countries are taking around the world. And my part of this was to summarize the world's response to EMF issues in terms of precautionary or preventative actions. The BioInitiative Working Group is a group that grew out of the meeting in Mexico at the Bioelectromagnetic Society. There was a lot of debate at that scientific conference about why it is that there are 30 years worth of scientific studies documenting bioeffects and adverse health effects from these exposures, and yet we are still living with the same old standards we've had for years. They get tweaked every few years, but not in any substantial way, and not in a way that takes into account our growing knowledge about health risks. So the BioInitiative Working Group originally had 4 members, a core organizing group, and the meeting occurred in June in Mexico, and by October we had decided that we would write a state-of-the-art report on electromagnetic fields and health risks. And we would use this to alert people in the world whose mission it is to translate science into good public health policy, and to tell and broadly to tell the public what these findings are. So between October of 2006 and August of 2007, which is a very short time, this group of 14 scientists and public health experts did their very best work in science chapters and public health chapters to evaluate and come up with recommendations. And so in a 9-month period, we have produced the only truly independent look at electromagnetic fields, radio frequency radiation, and health risks.
So in other words, you synthesized the data that was out there?
We did. Each of these people, each of these participants on the BioInitiative Working Group is in their own right a leading world expert. We had Henry Lai doing the work. Henry, of course, is at University of Washington, and he did the work on genotoxicity, or damage to the human genome. And he also did the very large chapter on neurology, the effects on the central nervous system, and effects on cognition, our ability to think, our effects on behavior, judgment, sleep, and so on, all of the neurological studies. And I think in total, we as a group probably looked at more than 2,000 studies. These are peer-reviewed, published science. They're not someone's, casual opinion of things. Leonard Hardell from Sweden did the work on brain tumors and cell phone use in cooperation with Kjell Hansen Mild. Both of them are highly respected in their fields. Michael Kundi from Austria worked on the chapter involving brain tumors that are non-cell phone related, and there is a large literature on that. We also had Eugene Sobel and Zora Devanapur, who are experts in the area of Alzheimer's and Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. And they provided a large chapter on the effects of ELF and, to a lesser extent, RF on Alzheimer's and breast cancer, including much of the melatonin work. So that was just vital. Ole Johansson from Sweden provided us with a very, very detailed chapter on the immune system and how many people become electrically sensitive. They become hypersensitive to exposures. Like many people are chemically sensitive to chemicals, there's a growing percentage of people in the world, estimated between 3 and 8% of everyone in the world, that is electrosensitive. And this is a dysfunction of the immune system. That's why Ole's involved. And the hypersensitivity is going to be a very large societal issue with huge financial costs. So this was another linchpin of the report.
Is that number growing of people?
That number appears to be growing. And given that we're continuing to deploy technologies that expose people on a daily basis to these emissions, we can expect that it will increase. Importantly, I think we also need to say that there were two key people involved in this who come at they come at the issue from a public health aspect. One of them is a preeminent public health expert, David Carpenter. He is now the head of an Institute of Health and the Environment at the University of Albany in New York. And he provided very key information for us in analyzing the science and trying to tell us what it meant, and in comparison to other things like smoking and cancer, or environmental tobacco smoke, secondhand smoke and cancer. He was able to say, look, we regulate some of these other things. We have enough evidence now to move from arguing the science, does it or does it not cause cancer and neurological problems, to what is the appropriate public health response given what we have and what do we need to do now. The other key person in this I want to mention is David G. He is with the European Environmental Agency in Denmark, and he is one of the primary authors of Late Lessons from Early Warnings, which is a book analyzing the failures of government around the world to respond to early indications in terms of lead in gasoline, diethylstilbestrol as an agent, a carcinogen, BSE, and overfishing in the Atlantic stocks of fisheries and so on, where really important public health and environmental issues have been debated because there's industry influence preventing action until action comes so late that the societal costs are huge. Well, we asked David G. to work with us to look at EMF issues today and the science, and to say, do we have enough now as an early warning, and is the consequence of doing nothing so great that we should be doing more? And his chapter, of course, has been pivotal in getting international attention to our report, because in fact the answer is yes. The response in Europe has been massive. We were overwhelmed with response, requests for interviews, media coverage, really excellent coverage in the news press from European countries and the Nordic countries. And in part this was due to the fact that David G's home agency, the European Environmental Agency, decided that this is so important an issue to them that they hadn't quite recognized until they saw the report, that they took this on as their own cause. And within 2 weeks, I think it's fair to say it's unprecedented that a single report, a dry science report, would cause a major environmental and public health agency to call for new policy and new study and new preventative actions. So In Europe, it's been very large. The International Herald Tribune has carried excellent analysis and response. And almost every other major European newspaper in all of the European countries have carried an article or two or three. In the United States, we have seen absolutely no coverage. It's very disappointing to see that the silence in our media, our print and our broadcast media, is absolute. And we'll be continuing to look for some change on this front, because these aren't just European health issues. These are issues in the United States, in the African countries, in the Asian countries, in Australia, and they're going to cost all of our societies very dearly if we don't pay attention.
We're talking about the Nordic countries and the European countries. How about the countries of the South? Was there any response from their press or their governments?
There have been media inquiries from every continent and many countries, but the preponderance of this has been in the European countries, where there is, interestingly, also a large public concern that is expressed and that is very evident in their press already, and that may be, in part why. Probably the next largest response has come from Australia, where, in fact, while we're in the BioInitiative Working Group recommending standards that are thousands of times below where they are today for public safety limits, Australia's government is proposing to relax their standards, to make it possible for people to be exposed to far more electromagnetic field exposure. So we've had quite a response from the public and from governmental agencies there. There's a big industry push to either keep the status quo or to relax standards in general among industries, from the electric utility industry in Australia to almost all the telecom organizations that lobby throughout the world. And in fact, even in the United States. It's amazing today that in the United States, the IEEE, which is the body that recommends new standards for radio frequency, for example, from cell phones, is proposing to loosen or to make less tough the standards we have right now for radio frequency radiation from cell phones. They want to allow the amount of heat a phone can put into your brain to be calculated over 10 grams of tissue rather than 1 gram like it is today. And that means you could have far higher exposures. Now, this proposal comes at a time where the BioInitiative Working Group has pointed out in our report that we're seeing brain tumor risk increase at 10 years and less of use. What you need to know with that is that almost everything else that can cause a brain tumor, mostly chemical exposures or ionizing radiation, take 20 years for these tumors to show up. Why is it we're seeing this increase start at 10 years with cell phones? Well, it means that cell phones are a very, very effective way of creating brain tumors, and it's happening in half the time. Okay, so here we have this paradox or this dilemma where the people that develop our standards are proposing to make it possible for far more radiation into the head, probably because cell phones today, by and large, don't meet the existing standards, so they have to be made less restrictive. It's a really unwarranted move, and we hope that our report will have the effect in this country of dissuading our decision makers at the Federal Communications Commission from even looking at these proposed, less restrictive standards. Some of the other members of the BioInitiative Working Group that contributed science chapters included Carl Blackman, who did our work as an individual, although he is, of course, employed by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And he contributed a chapter on modulation effects. This has to do with the way in which pulsed radio frequency or electromagnetic fields can be received by the body as different kinds of signals. And modulation is important because in some delivery, some deliveries of radio frequency are more bioactive than others. So this was a key chapter. Martin Blank from Columbia University contributed the chapter on heat shock protein or stress proteins. And a very important finding that is brought out in our report is that when you see stress proteins produced in the body, this is a very ancient response of all cells, literally in plants and animals and people. When you see heat shock proteins being expressed by cells or being created, it means the cell is in trouble and it's hollering help. It's got a problem with the environment around it that isn't good for it. And what Martin has been able to show is that when you're exposed to very low levels of electromagnetic fields, we see stress proteins created. And what that tells us is that maybe in the short term, the body will get over it or it'll adapt. But if you do this day in and day out, chronically, these things have very serious consequences for the body. And they are actually a part of the plausible biological mechanism that we talk about for ultimate chronic health problems and diseases and threats to health, which can be carcinogens or they can be neurotoxins. Martin Blank's work, of course, has just been key for this, and the levels at which he's finding the effect on stress proteins are environmental levels. They are levels to which most people in urbanized countries are exposed. Cell phones, cell towers, power lines, appliances, and the gamut. Cordless phones as well as cell phones are implicated not only in heat shock protein or stress protein responses, but they're also they look to be just as deadly as cell phones when you look at brain tumors and acoustic neuromas, another form of tumor in the head. So importantly, people need to know that it isn't just mobile phones, but it is also cordless phones that are showing increased risk of brain tumors. The final group working with our team on the BioInitiative is from China. And we had 2 doctors from China, from Beijing, who did some very interesting work on the effect of electromagnetic fields on the human genome. Brand new area of science, transcriptomics and proteomics. And these are just big words for actually looking into what these fields do down at the DNA level, at the gene level. And their studies are reporting lots of positive effects, negative and positive both. So we were very happy to have their collaboration. And my role in this, other than being one of the founding members of the BioInitiative Working Group, was to be the person who wrote about preventative action, precautionary public health planning, public policy issues, and I am also a co-editor with David Carpenter on the report. The studies that were produced in the chapter by our Chinese participants talked about it included studies that were both reporting effects and studies that reported no effect. So we have some of each kind. But overall, we shouldn't be seeing any studies reporting effects on the human gene from these levels of exposures. And if we are, what it means is that our standards are not good enough. They are inadequate. The general conclusions of the BioInitiative report are these. The existing standards that we have worldwide for electromagnetic fields, including power lines, including cell phones, including cell towers, cordless phones, basically all of these things we've looked at. These standards that we have today are thousands of times too high. It's inescapable. If you look at the studies in aggregate, if you look at all of the science studies, they clearly tell us that we are living in a world today where the standards that we have do not protect public health. And the consequences of not doing something about this are going to be huge in terms of public health, in terms of sickness for people, in terms of lower quality of life because people don't feel well, they don't work well, in these environments. And the cost to society over time, if we do nothing, are going to be enormous. So we have all the makings of an early warning here. And we don't just need trivial or do nothing kinds of cures. We are so far down the road in understanding the problem that we are calling for very substantial change. The biological effects that we see are occurring thousands of times lower than our standards. We need new standards. It's fine to keep the old ones because the old standards protect us against being burned or being cooked or being electrocuted. What they don't do is protect us against cancer and diseases like Alzheimer's and Lou Gehrig's disease, miscarriage, and the other constellation of things that we strongly suspect are occurring. So we think we need an entirely new set of standards to address these new technologies, and they need to be biologically based. What that means is we ought to look at these 2,000 studies or more, and we ought to see what kind of biological effects are occurring, and we ought to design new standards that protect us and provide a safety factor below the levels where we're seeing risks start. So for childhood leukemia, which is a done deal, I mean, there's really no more question. Power line exposures, electromagnetic field exposures cause childhood leukemia, at least some part of it, and maybe a very big part of it. And we're looking at levels of 1 milligauss, maybe 1 and a little milligauss. We're not looking at 100 or 1,000, and our current limit is 904. In terms of radio frequency radiation, we don't yet know the lower limit of health risk. Every time we get a new technology that drops the level of exposure down lower, we still find people getting sick. Some fraction of the population or some special group. Children are particularly vulnerable. The ill are particularly vulnerable. The aged are particularly vulnerable. So we don't know a lower limit. We're going to recommend new biologically based standards be developed, and they better key to these studies and these effects we're seeing. But we're not yet prepared to say how low, because it may be, in the worst case, there is no lower limit. If it is truly informational content, rather than the amount of energy and heating, if that's true, then some of these technologies may not be possible, and at the same time maintain our own well-being and health. One of the things that I think we've seen clearly now in looking at all of the science is that it isn't the amount of heat that matters. It's not the amount of heat from the cell phone. It's not a thermal effect. It's not like if you cut out the heat, you don't have a biological effect that can lead to a brain tumor. Somehow, because these levels now that are causing these effects, these levels keep creeping lower and lower, the way better to describe it is it's the informational content of the signal coming at you. The radio frequency signal or the ELF signal is somehow being detected by the body, being amplified by the body, and the body is responding to it in a way that says, I'm in distress, or I can't metabolize properly, my heart isn't operating properly, I'm not sleeping properly, and then you have a constellation of effects that follow on, all of which create ill health, or your well-being, your ability to function is impaired. So if it's the kind of signal you're getting and the way it interacts with the body, heating is irrelevant. It's the information of the signal that counts. In talking to people about why we're not able yet to say with authority what the lower limit should be for radio frequency radiation, I tell them this. In the year 2000, when I went to Salzburg to an international conference to talk about radio frequency health effects and the scientific studies, at that time we thought that about 1 microwatt per centimeter squared, just remember the number 1, might be a good number. Even though the standard was up here at 1,000, we thought that maybe 1 was going to be okay for chronic exposure. Well, we're now in 2007, and I personally think that we have to be down at about a nanowatt, 1,000 times lower than 1 microwatt, in order to begin to say it's possible that's okay for chronic exposure. And when we see technologies perhaps in the future that are emitting at something lower than a nanowatt, we'll have to wait and see what happens. One of the things that we've learned recently in looking at John Goffman's work on ionizing radiation at low dose, in particular related to mammograms, that there really is no low limit at which things are safe. There is always an effect, and it's always adverse. So no lower limit to ionizing harm. I think we may be in the same area with non-ionizing radiation, and in fact, part of the literature that you can find on this subject that we've worked on is the bystander effect. The bystander effect says that if you hit one cell precisely with ionizing radiation, somehow cells that aren't even connected, that are more distant in location, are also damaged or die. And what that means is that the way that this works is not fully explained. We don't know everything yet. So the standards that we've derived based on very limited understanding of the body's inner workings are not protective. And it's really scientific arrogance to think that because scientists can't explain an effect, it doesn't exist. One of the things that the report suggests is that cell phones should be entirely redesigned. So they don't work when you put them to your head. They work only in speaker mode, or you have to have a wired earpiece to use them. And you also shouldn't wear them. If they aren't redesigned, we can't see a safe way for them to operate at the levels they emit today and in the fashion that they work today. For people who say, I can't imagine ever being able to give up my cell phone or my BlackBerry or my Trio, what we can do is to say to them, well, look, you can tremendously minimize your exposure. Use a wired earpiece. Do not use a wireless earpiece. Do not use a Bluetooth type mechanism, because the cumulative dose from these is going to be very large, and you're not being informed of that. Cordless phones, again, should be considered just like cell phones, and every design change should apply to cordless phones as well. We're a little concerned that in some states, including California, we're going to have a new law that says you cannot drive while holding, a handheld cell phone. And that's going to drive people to use these new wireless devices, which in themselves are going to have bioeffects. So we need a complete top-to-bottom review, and in the interim, I think we need to halt the deployment of these new technologies and the deployment and proliferation of base stations or cell towers until we are able to say with some better certainty we know how to do it right, because right now it's clear we're doing it wrong. If you look at this issue in terms of what we should have learned from smoking and lung cancer and secondhand radiation and cancer, I would simply do this for parents. If you wouldn't buy these for your kids, and these are candy cigarettes, you certainly wouldn't want to buy a candy toy cell phone, because I think in 10 years we're going to be looking at these two as equally harmful, meaning the real McCoy, real cigarettes, real cell phones. And there is no excuse to start children off using these cell phone devices at an early age, and probably even into young adulthood, considering that their brains are still hardwiring and brain development and neurological development isn't complete until your early 20s. We have no business providing kids with things that are probably going to turn out to be more dangerous than cigarettes. Certainly in the short term, the brain tumor risk is going to be higher.
What would you say to parents who are dubious about wireless things being set up in their children's schools?
Wireless internet is another area where we get a lot of inquiries, and in schools it's become popular to install wireless internet connections for children's laptops. The exposure that a child would get in a school, going through a school like this, and from elementary to middle school to high school, would be very considerable over a lifetime. And we really recommend against it now, because it appears that it's an experiment where we don't know the health result, and it isn't worth the risk. Can we quantify the risk yet? No, because we're not allowed to do experiments on children. But every indication is that if wireless technologies and their emissions have such a big impact on adults from the studies we have, it will be worse on children. So we have good alternatives. You can have great internet connections with cable modem, a wired alternative, so we don't need it. Why take the chance? The scientific evidence today is stronger than it was for environmental tobacco smoke or secondhand smoke and cancer. So, if parents would ignore health warnings for cigarettes, then I can see where they might ignore the health studies we have today for cell phones. It would be a very bad idea to ignore these warnings, but the evidence is there. The industry would like for you to think that we have to have conclusive scientific evidence, which is just a ridiculously high level of proof before we do anything at all. And this just is not the case. In smart public health policy, you react when you begin to see the evidence mounting up and the trend is toward showing an effect. You don't wait until the industry is finally willing to admit that it can't hide the fact anymore that they're selling a carcinogen. So if you buy the argument that you need proof, absolute proof, and proof according to the industry that you have harmful substances with these devices, then you would wait. But I can't imagine any parent saying a cell phone and the use of a cell phone is so important to my child and my family that we will risk this and wait for proof. They're going to act on the evidence. And we're really hoping school districts are going to do the same thing. Because when children are mandated to go to school and you can afford only a public school, you can't afford a private school, you are stuck as a family with whatever that district decides to install in terms of wireless. So this is an area where we really hope that parents and administrators will get together and err on the side of caution and not go wireless for now.
Can you give any exposure comparisons between the wireless exposure in a school and, say, from a cell phone? I think I've read that somewhere.
There are some estimates by Alastair Phillips. He is an expert in the United Kingdom. He is a man who runs an organization called PowerWatch, which is technically very good. And he has estimated that for a student sitting in a classroom, in a normal school, in a classroom, where you have 20 or 30 students all working on wireless computers, 20 minutes of cell phone use is equivalent to 1 hour in that classroom. It seems high, but those are the numbers. And certainly it's not, this wireless exposure in classrooms is not trivial. If you've got everybody working on their computer and they're all wireless, a couple of hours is a huge exposure. Now, it's interesting, an interesting comparison is the comparison to the brain tumor studies on cell phones, because most people think it takes a lot of exposure to a cell phone to have an increased rate of brain tumors show up. And in fact, we're beginning to see it with only 260 lifetime hours of exposure. You begin to see the risk with only 260 hours. Leonard Hardell's work looks toward the top end of users, the heavy users, and he looks at anybody with 2,000 or more lifetime hours of exposure, and he's seeing very substantial and statistically significant increased risk of brain tumors and acoustic neuromas with 2,000 or more hours. Well, I work with people, I know people who average 900 minutes a month. So in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, a year, I do the calculation, but a couple of years and you've hit your maximum 2,000 hours easily. I have great concern that for the brain tumor and acoustic neuroma risk, the threshold for danger is so low. You're over it, you're over it, you're over it. We're all over it if we've used a cell phone in work for a few years, 3 years, 5 years. So this is going to come back to haunt us, and we're really going to we're really going to have to pay attention. Students who were tested on cell phones while driving, or simulated driving, were shown to have the reaction time of elderly people when they were under the influence, either the radio frequency or the diversion, or both. But they were acting like old people when they were driving as they used a cell phone. The effect of cell phones on young people in terms of brain tumors is the highest risk of any age category that we're seeing. Leonard Hardell reported that for the ages 20 to 29-year-old category, they had an 8-fold increase of brain tumor risk, or an 800% increased risk of brain tumor. So it was the young kids who had started as teenagers, within a few years, when they reached their mid-20s, showing a very significantly increased risk of brain tumors. RFID, and I'd have to say it's one more layer of radio frequency we don't need. I personally, I so object to those being sewn into the hem of my new clothes that I buy, or they come on the printer cartridges for my computer printer. And I think this is just an industry-friendly way of them saving money and shifting the health burden to us, and I really object to it.
Are there indications that chipping of dogs and children causes any ill effect?
There are absolutely some provocative new studies that we should have been paying attention to, and we weren't paying attention to, that say tumors develop at the site of the implanted chip. If you put a chip, radio frequency chip, in a dog, in case the dog gets lost, that chip in itself is going to present risk, a health risk, a tumor risk. Now, if that's true, we really are not getting the story on RFID chips. And to be inserting them into Alzheimer's patients because they might get lost is just is unwarranted.
And children?
Well,
Be safe.
It's
like that's the excuse for cell phones too. My kid I'm afraid.
I'm so afraid. I'm so afraid. I'm so afraid. Michael Moore's I'm so afraid. We're all so afraid. We're made to be afraid because then we mind and we obey. I really I can think of absolutely no rationale. Nothing warrants putting a chip in a child to keep track of that child unless they have some incredibly exceptional reason, medical reason or impairment reason. And these technologies, just because we can do them, doesn't mean we should do them. And no one is looking at the side effects, and we should be.